All right. I'm live with John Buck and Ben Watkins and Danny. Don't know your last name, Danny, but and Danny's the only one who hasn't been on before. And we're going to be debating divine simplicity and whether it entails a modal collapse or not. And if you're not familiar with that debate, we'll explain it. And yeah, Danny, since you're the newest person here, why don't you go ahead and introduce and share anything about your channel, whatever you like.
Hey guys, thanks for having me on. Dry apologist. I own a channel, or I have a channel called Phil Talk. I go around YouTube looking for StreamYard links and causing trouble. And that is my purpose in life. So that's all about me.
All right, nice. I can respect that. All right, and then Ben or John, do either of you want to share anything you have coming up? Or?
Yeah, so December 3rd, which is this coming Friday, I will be debating Trent Horn again on the When Belief Dies podcast. And so the question is abortion. However, it's a devil's advocate debate. So I'm pro-choice and Trent is pro-life, and we're switching. And so I'm going to be defending the pro-life position, and he's going to be defending the pro-choice position. So it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm not going to lie. Like, people think that these are like really hard or like kind of intimidating things. For me, they're like really fun. Like, I'm really excited.
Yeah, and Ben has a devil's advocate debate on my channel with Randall Rouser. So check that
yes,
out
which
people have it.
Ton of fun again.
Yeah. I don't have anything in the works exactly. I keep on like talking about this video on epistemology that I want to do, and I've already like written the script. I just need to like go through it again just to see whether I like it or not, and then eventually post it. But I've been saying that for like the last year, so as it is, it's kind of been put off for so long that I'm not even sure if it's gonna see the light of day. But I still like it, so I hope to eventually put it out on my channel. But don't get your hopes up. I'll just say.
All right. Well, thanks for sharing and thanks for coming on. So tonight it's going to be me and John, or however you want to say that, and against Ben and Danny on divine simplicity. And John and I will be defending divine simplicity and that it does not entail a modal collapse. And then Ben and Danny will be arguing that it does, or at least exploring that. I don't know how committed they are on that position, but Ben's going to go ahead and break down the argument for us, or at least a version of it. And then it'll just be kind of a free-flowing discussion, about the argument. So, Ben, if you want to post whatever, if you want to share that.
Yes, I'm sharing my screen now.
Oh, let's wait a
second. So y'all can see it just fine now, right?
All right. Yeah. If there's a way to zoom in, that would be good. But if not, if you just want to read it.
There are ways to zoom in. How's that? More?
If you can zoom in some more, like all the way if possible.
How's that?
Yeah, that looks pretty good.
Yeah.
Sweet. Okay, so to start off, I first need to kind of explain what a modal collapse is, and so what the worry is here. And so a modal collapse is when the distinction between necessity and contingency in the world is collapsed, such that the distinction isn't meaningful. Everything just becomes necessary. And so this is what's called modal fatalism. And so it seems to kind of undermine the free will of both the world and of God, kind of the free will that we might have and the free will in which God might have in exercising free action. And that this is worrisome because, perfect being theism implies that God is perfectly free. And so there's two broad types of modal collapse arguments. So there's what are called powers-based modal collapse arguments that say that there's something with God's act that implies a modal collapse. And then there are knowledge-based modal collapse arguments. So these arguments say that there's something about God's knowledge that implies a modal collapse. And so I would just briefly outline both of those real quick. So to start with the power-based what I call the argument from freedom, we start with God's perfectly free act. So we want to say that perfect being theism implies God is perfectly free, and that God's intentional act to create our universe is contingent, because God could have intended to create something else or even nothing at all. But God's intentional act could not have been otherwise given classical theism and the doctrine of divine simplicity, because on that view, God is purely actual. God's intentional act is necessary because God is identical to his existence in all possible worlds, and God's existence necessarily lacks the potential to be otherwise. If contingency is a necessary condition for God's intentional act to be otherwise, and God lacks such potential, then God cannot be perfectly free. And so in this discussion brief, I go over the doctrine of divine simplicity, and I mention concepts that I think are really important, like divine providence and perfect freedom and God's intentional act. And we can come back to that in the course of the discussion, but for the sake of time, I'll just show what I think is the simple argument from freedom. So I think this helps us see the problem most clear. And so there's an expanded one, and again, we'll go into the expanded one if we need to, but for time, I'll just stick with the simple argument from freedom, which says that the first premise is that God's intentional act is purely actual by the definition of classical theism. And that the second premise is that whatever is purely actual is devoid of any potentialities, which follows from the definition of purely actual. Therefore, God's intentional act is by definition devoid of any potentialities. But then we want to say that intentional acts devoid of any potentialities are also devoid of any contingencies, and intentional acts devoid of any contingencies could not have been otherwise, and intentional acts that could not have been otherwise are not perfectly free. Therefore, it follows that God's intentional act is not perfectly free. And perfect being theism implies God's intentional act by definition is perfectly free. Therefore, we can conclude that the conjunction of perfect being theism and classical theism is impossible. And so it's important to notice that this entire argument is analytic. So all of its premises are true by definition, or are trivially true. This is an a priori argument that the conjunction of perfect being theism and classical theism is impossible. So no such view could possibly be true. So that's kind of broadly how I see the powers-based modal collapse argument. There's a knowledge-based one too that has been called the aloneness argument. So let me zoom in again here. So according to classical theism, whatever is intrinsic to God is also identical to God. So God is identical with God's act of knowing. Consequently, God is identical to his one simple divine act across all possible worlds. In other words, God's act of knowing, intentionally creating, and providentially governing our universe is identical with God's essence and existence across all possible worlds. Perfect being theism implies that God's act of knowing that our created world exists is contingent because God could have existed alone and instead known that nothing else other than himself actually existed. And so again, I go through some key concepts, but we can come back to these if we need to later. The real simple aloneness argument is that according to classical theism, God's knowledge is identical to God's essence and existence across all possible worlds. So none of God's knowledge can be contingent. But then according to perfect being theism, God could have existed alone because in some possible world, he could have created nothing at all. So God's knowledge that nothing else existed in the world would be contingent because it would not be the same across all possible worlds. Therefore, the conjunction of classical theism and perfect being theism is impossible, and therefore it follows that classical theism would be impossible. So those are the two broad modal collapse arguments as I see them. The first, the power-based modal collapse argument, and the second, the knowledge-based modal collapse argument. Now I know that's a lot to kind of throw out on the table, and I kind of skipped over characterizing some really key concepts that I think we really should spend some time talking about, like the nature of the doctrine of divine simplicity and kind of the disagreements that go about how we're supposed to understand that or interpret that doctrine. And so I don't want people to misrepresent people and think that we can just gloss over that, like I have here for the sake of brevity. So I think that's a good place to turn it over to the floor. Danny, did you want to add anything to that as far as your understanding of modal collapse?
I guess also we want to be clear on the particular construal of divine simplicity. There are different versions. So I would want to get their account of what they take the thesis to be to make sure that the argument applies to their conception. But yeah, so I'd want to go over that.
Sweet. So Caleb and John, the first thing I want to know is do you think that I was fairly representing the classical theist tradition, at least prima facie? Now there might have been something, there are claims that I made that we can quibble about, but like overall, I think I've it's a really difficult thing to understand. So I feel like I've made progress in my understanding of it.
No, yeah. I think you did quite well, especially since it does seem like, especially, prima facie, there are some clear reasons to think that divine simplicity entails a modal collapse, given certain presuppositions, or even given some defenses that other classical theists will use in order to defend their classical theism. Does seem to entail a modal collapse. Like there's some that even will lean into it, like Catherine Rogers, I'm sure, is like a sort of notable classical theist that sort of accepts a sort of modal collapse. And some might say even Anselm as well might have been somebody that accepted some type of modal collapse as well. I haven't really read much Anselm firsthand, but at least from some of the few things I've read, it does sound like, this isn't quite exactly.
I think Kathleen Rogers just calls it something else. I think she calls it
modal simplicity.
Yeah. It has a nicer
just
ring to it.
Yeah. But I think that was a good presentation. I don't know, Caleb, your thoughts?
Now, just to clarify for the audience, so the basic tradition of divine simplicity is that God has no parts or distinctions. So the classic statement is that God is what he has. So he's just one singular undivided substance. So it does seem to plausibly follow that, God is equivalent to his, his intention or his act. And then if he's a necessary being, then his action is necessary. Then it seems like he doesn't have free will. It's just the thrust of the argument, or at least on the powers-based one. So maybe we can. So yeah, I agree with.
I do want to say one more thing. Sorry, just real quick, because I'm kind of an atheist on the outside looking in on a disagreement. This is kind of an in-house disagreement. Why do I say that? Why do I think that's the case? Because I don't think that this particular problem of modal collapse applies to theistic personalist models or non-classical theist models of God. Models of God that deny the doctrine of divine simplicity, I think, just straightforwardly avoid this problem. And so that this is a theoretical virtue in favor of a different model of God. And so my dog in the race is really only to say, I think that this is one reason why we should prefer the non-classical models of God to classical models of God that affirm something like the doctrine of divine simplicity.
And I also want to be clear. I've heard people that adopt non-classical conceptions of God and say that God is simple, but they're just talking about God's not being made of material parts. So I
Someone
think-
like Swinburne.
right. The idea there is that when in the doctrine, as I understand it, is going to take it a step forward, that it's that God is not made up of parts in any sense of the word, including metaphysical parts, whatever that may be. So so we're not talking about, it seems like you could reject this doctrine and still also think that God is not made of material parts. So
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and like to sort of clarify like what it might mean to say that God is made up of metaphysical parts is maybe like if you were a Platonist of some sort and you thought that God is good, like is a statement that says that God participates within goodness. And so that's a sense in which God has some sort of property of goodness that he's distinct from. Like there's not an ontological grounding that's common between God and goodness, but God still has this goodness as like part of him somehow. Or like something else that you might want to say, that God is powerful. Like if you want to attribute power to God as if it were some sort of like, I don't know, a property, like either in a Platonic sense or maybe some other sense, like if you were say it's like some particular object that God somehow like has it as part of his ontology somehow. So that would be like a point where classical theists would want to say, no, if it's true that God is good, then it's not going to be the case that goodness is something distinct from and exists distinct from God, but rather is going to be identical to God and his existence. And so there would need to be a way in which like the classical theist will sort of defend that position, and maybe taking a sort of understanding of goodness as being like that which is desirable, and God is like ultimately desirable or something like that. That would be a way in which like they'd want to say that something, whatever God is going to be good, at least in some sort of sense, without saying that God is good in a sort of extrinsic sense, where like he takes his goodness from something other than himself. So
Yeah, so maybe let's focus on the powers-based argument first. That's all right, and then we can give some thoughts about where we might, or John and I might push back on the argument, and then maybe we can look at the aloneness one if you guys want. So I think both John and I are both going to push back on the powers argument, in that, though I think a little bit differently, that we're going to want to argue that God's action or his act of creating is distinct from his being, and that it shouldn't be equated in the same way that like his ontology, it shouldn't be considered a part of his ontology, properly speaking. So there is room for contingency in God's actions, even though God himself, but we want to argue that wouldn't introduce a complexity within God. Now this has been defended some in the literature, but how it gets defended can go different routes. So I'm more inclined to think that God's actions can be intrinsic to God and contingent, but they're just not contingent properties. And I don't see a conflict with holding that view in divine simplicity. I just wouldn't articulate a divine simplicity the way that Thomas might, but I would just say that conceptually, I don't see it as problematic. Now, John might want to go a different route in arguing that actions are extrinsic to God, which has been more popularly defended recently. So maybe if you want to cash that out, I don't know if that's still your view, but if
that's right. So I would think that like following sort of Aristotle, that like an action that an agent performs it's not going to reside in the agent itself, but rather is going to reside in the thing that is being acted upon. So like when I say that John Buck kills Danny, the predication that I'm assigning to John Buck is kills Danny. And that's going to be it's going to be I'll use the term praxeological predication, which just means like what a thing does rather than what a thing is. And if I was going to say John Buck is 6'1", that would be an ontological predication that I'm assigning to the subject John Buck. And so anyway, when I use the sort of statement John Buck kills Danny is going to be ontologically posterior to the ontology of John Buck. So that's why I'd want to say that it's extrinsic, because the only way that I can perform some action is if I already exist. And the action that I'm going to perform is going to be in something other than myself. So the action of killing Danny would be to bring about some change in Danny, like the fact that he's no longer alive. And that would be like consistent with my remaining the same, pretty much. It would just be the case that the event of Danny's dying would have been brought about by the subject, John Buck. So that's sort of the points that I want to sort of throw out there, that, yeah, an action that an agent produces is going to exist extrinsically to the agent. It's also going to have a different ontology to the agent, because the whole sort of statement sort of contains John Buck already in it. And so John Buck must already exist in order to act. Similar to that, God must exist prior to performing any action in the world. And so that's why I'd want to say that any action that God does is going to exist extrinsically to him. And so it won't be part of his ontology at all. Like, we could say that God performs a multitude of actions. Like, every time he creates a different world or state of affairs, that's another action that God does. But because these actions are going to is basically going to be cashed out by saying, okay, world X was brought about by God, or depends upon God in order for it to exist, or something like that, then all these actions that God is producing is not going to be intrinsic to him. It's rather going to be intrinsic to the world that he's creating these things. No, it's not praxeological predication, but praxeological. So praxis would be like in ethics when we're talking about, like, how do we do something? So I'm just using that praxis and then ology for the study of, like, what a thing does.
When we use a verb.
Yeah.
When we use a verb. Something ending in ing.
Yeah, just wanting to contrast it from any type of verb is going to be a type of praxeology or a
whereas if we're talking about
predication.
a noun, we might be talking about something with an ontologically weighty implication, something like a person, a place, or a thing.
Right, exactly. So like I said earlier, John Buck is 6'1" would be an ontological predication that I'm assigning to me, whereas John Buck kills Danny is going to be a praxeological predication. And so a praxeological predication doesn't necessarily entail an ontological one. But in order for the modal collapse argument to work, there would have to be a sort of like strict entailment from the praxeological predication that's true to there being some sort of ontological difference in the cause of that action. Okay, that's my spiel.
Ben, did you want to go, or?
Yeah, so can y'all see my screen that says objections?
There we go. Yeah.
Sweet. Okay. So when I have been working with this powers-based modal collapse arguments, the objections that I get overwhelmingly fall within two specific objections. And so I think the objections on the table right here fall within this first of those objections, this idea that God's intentional act is extrinsic of God's essence or existence somehow. And so y'all might disagree about how y'all cash that out. I don't know, but it seems like y'all largely agreed from what I got from that. It seems like y'all are on the same page about your approach to trying to carve out this contingency aspect of God. And so the two replies that just seem kind of obvious and straightforward. The first being that the doctrine of divine simplicity implies that God is not composed of distinct or composite parts. So to just say that, God's intentional act is somehow separate from God's essence and existence seems to just deny the doctrine of divine simplicity by conceding that God does have these metaphysical parts. And then the second reply has to do with the ontological point that seems to, that there's this, we can talk about God's intentional act without any commitments about ontology or somehow. But I don't think that's quite right, because perfect being theism implies that the source of contingency of our world is intrinsic to God. as God's intentional act is the source of everything extrinsic to God. So there's God, and then there's nothing else extrinsic to God without whatever's intrinsic to God causing something extrinsic of God to exist. And so I think these I obviously think that, theists are committed, or at least classical theists are committed to this idea that God is not composed of distinct parts, and that they're committed to everything. God is the source of contingency. Everything intrinsic to God is the source of contingency in our world. There's not something else beyond God that can ground the contingency of the world. It has to be something intrinsic to God.
Okay, yeah, I think I'm getting kind of what you're saying. That, like, if we're saying that the cause of the world resides extrinsically to God, well, then that no longer makes God the cause of the world, because, like, as any theist will want to say, that God is the creator of the world. And
I'm also thinking a much broader context. There's the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And so I take it that the theist thinks they have an advantage here in answering this question, because the theist is committed to something like a doctrine of creation ex nihilo. God created something out of nothing. There was God, there's nothingness, like not anything, and then God made something out of that. There wasn't something else that caused it to be, come into being. There was, or, God is not, this is not somehow a part of God. God created something separate and distinct from himself. There's a dualism kind of built into it.
I see what you're saying. That, like, yeah, if God's creation of the world required something other than God, then we no longer have creation ex nihilo. We have some sort of creation ex material. Or
something else. We want to say, so the dualism, at least, I'm not trying to saddle y'all with substance dualism and philosophy of mind, but at least a dualism in like creator and creation.
Right.
There's a radical distinction that theism has in there. And I take that as, that assumption is what it brings the advantage to the question, why is there something rather than nothing? It would seem very strange for a classical theist to just give up that advantage to answering that question. You see what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah. And I definitely would want to, like, reject the idea. And so maybe there's a tension here. I'll have to play this out, that God's extrinsic actions are what cause the world to be, but rather God, basically in the sense that without need of anything prior or additional to him, creates the world. So if we're saying that God's action of creating the world is extrinsic to God, then is there a conflict there? I'm gonna have to see if there's some sort of contradiction here between saying that the God causes the world basically wholly of himself, and God's creation of the world is extrinsic to himself. And I think the difference is aren't
those metaphysical parts? I feel like we're just giving God metaphysical parts at this point.
Well, let's see, if when I refer to creation, that's the act of bringing about the created order, the rest of the world, all of the contingent things.
Sure.
And so that is definitely going to be extrinsic to God, because it's not referring to God; it's referring to things in the world.
Absolutely.
And we're just
creator creation, very sharp distinction between creator and creation. Yes.
Yeah. And so if we want to say that the bringing about of all these extrinsic things was from God alone, with nothing else, then I think what I'm wanting to say is that what God does will refer to the created order, all contingently existing things, and then how God does will refer to God alone, because it's not like God requires anything else besides himself in order to create. And so I think that's where I'd want to clarify the distinction when we're talking about God's act of creation. There's two ways in which to sort of understand that. God's act of creation in that what God does, versus God's act of creation in how God does. like how God does certain things. And so I definitely want to say that how God does certain things is going to refer wholly to God alone. And then what God does is going to refer wholly to the created order alone, the rest of the world. And so that would be the extrinsic, and this would be the intrinsic.
You want to go ahead, Ben? Okay.
Oh yeah. So I find that interesting because it seems like you want to say, what God does. I'm referring to God's intentional act. So if if you're saying that what God does doesn't refer to God, but to something extrinsic of God, well, then it sounds like if I were to say God's intentional purpose for the world. Again, I think that theists think that they have an advantage here in meaning of life questions. God has a purpose. Well, on this model, it seems that God does whatever the purpose of meaning of life is, whatever the purpose of life is, we decide it. Creation decides it, not God.
I wanted to reinforce what you just said there, Ben. If we're talking about what we're talking about the action, God's action, and I think that action implicitly implies intention. And so, if in your example where you act to kill me, that implies a will of yours, a desire of yours, and that's going to be a view not of the event in which I die. All right. So to understand action wholly in terms of an extrinsic to an agent, I guess I would want to question that, given that action implies intentionality, implies will, and that's of the agent.
Right. Okay. So yeah, I think there's maybe a couple ways, and I'm still trying to figure out which was maybe the best way to respond. There's a way in which I can say that I act intentionally if I act and I have reasons for my action. And like it could be the case that I act in some way other than the reasons that I had. So that would just be like getting into libertarian freedom, where like I have reasons to do X and I also have reasons to do Y, and then I do X. That would be an instance where I do X and I have reasons to do X, but it was not necessarily the case that I do X, because I also could have done Y instead of X. And like what you were bringing up, Ben, is like under perfect being theism, God must be perfectly free, in that like he has the power, has the ability to do otherwise than what he ends up doing. So in regards to like intentionality and whether we want to say intentionality is intrinsic or extrinsic to God, let's see. If you want, Caleb, you can sort of bring up your case, because I'm sure you're probably more inclined to say that intentionality is intrinsic to God, while I try to, I don't know, give you an opportunity to speak, I guess.
Yeah, well, I'm fine with letting it kind of play out. So, yeah, I'm still attracted to defending that divine simplicity is compatible with God having contingent, intrinsic intentions, although that's controversial. But just to defend the extrinsic model, I think the way I've thought about it is that it's something that's extrinsic, but that God is still responsible for. So God is still responsible for creation and his extrinsic actions. It's just in willing an action, it becomes something extrinsic to God. But it's not that God isn't in control of that or responsible for it. Otherwise, then I agree it would face some severe problems. And I understand there are some, who argue that, but I think that might be the route that one defending that the intention is extrinsic. They could say, well, by the very nature of an intention, it becomes extrinsic, although the agent is still responsible for it, is the way I've thought about it. And that certainly could be pushed back on whether or not that's a plausible conception or not. But I think that's where they would want to go with it. That's something that kind of flows from the mind, but God's mind is still responsible causally for it. But I don't know, you guys could comment on some of that.
Now, I do think that like there's a way in which we can refer to God's creation of the world and say that God has an intention. And you could almost like read that as like an ascribing some sort of property to God, which is exactly like what
that's the concern, right?
We'll want to avoid. But there's another way in which to sort of like articulate that same sort of idea without relying on this sort of property language or anything like that at all, but using intentional as a sort of adverb to his creation. So God intentionally creates the world. And like, as we were discussing before, like it's nouns and adjectives that are going to be what we want to avoid as, or like if we're saying that God is X, then we're going to want to say that that's identical to God. But if we're using, let's say, adverbs in regards to saying God intentionally creates the world, or God intentionally brings Caleb about into existence, then that would be not necessarily an ascription of the intention to God, but rather, and it would be an ascription of the intention to the action of bringing Caleb about. And so maybe it doesn't make much sense to say that God intentionally brings about Caleb, where we're ascribing intentionality to the action rather than to the agent performing the action. But that at least seems like a somewhat plausible and common to our own usage of language in saying these sorts of things. Like I would say, I intentionally moved this piece somewhere on the chessboard and something like that. And that's going to be an adjective to the verb of moving the piece to the chessboard.
Yeah, I think that to your first point about the adverb, there's a different. If we take the statement, Danny.
Oh, wait. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Danny squints,
Mhm.
right? Versus Danny intentionally squints. I think that the idea is that in the first statement allows for the possibility of that happening dispositionally. That's to say, without my will, without my, there's no choice in the matter, right? When I step outside and the sun shines on my face,
It's involuntary.
it's involuntary, right? So what the adverb does is actually commit you to an ontological state that there's a will. And so I'm not so sure if the adverb play helps if the adverb just sort of implies this ontological commitment that there's will involved in the causal narrative. And then I think then you, on your second point, the idea is that when you say that you attribute intentionality to action, right? And here, to me, this is like saying I attribute maleness to bachelor. Whereas if we're the notion of action, at least in this context, already on my view, implies an intention plus some kind of consequence, maybe a behavior, a disposition, like a material creation, let's say. But maybe I need to further understand your point on the latter point that you made.
Right. So maybe like what I was saying earlier about how you have John Buck kills Danny. We have John Buck first, and then we have the action that John commits. And so similar to that, when we say John Buck intends to kill Danny, we're going to have that same sort of ontological reality and then the action. So that's a sense in which I intend to kill Danny is something extrinsic to me. It's something not laden within my own ontology, but rather, yeah, exactly. So like, it does seem like I can intend to do something, and that's in a sense something that's produced by me, and so it's going to be something distinct from me, but it's not going to be a property that I have. Or
Wait, okay, so you're saying, I'm saying that when you intentionally kill me, that we're ontologically committed to a will, right? We're ontologically committed to a desire, a reason. And either
there's a morally relevant distinction here too. This is the between intentionally killing you and unintentionally killing you.
Mm-hmm. And the idea here is that either that intention is of an event or of a substance, or you could say it's the intention is of the agent or not of the agent, right? And it seems like it's very weird to say that the intention is not of the agent. Otherwise, it wouldn't be their will, right? I guess you want to take the intention and place it elsewhere other than where I think it belongs, to the agent. Is that kind of what you're trying to do?
Well, it would be produced by the agent, but I don't know if it would be like a property of the agent, because
it'd have to be something intrinsic to God. Because we're talking about the active in creation. It's not something extrinsic to God.
Right. So yeah, if what we mean by an intention is just a reason that supports an action, then that could be intrinsic to God. And that would be also necessary. Like it could be the case that God has a reason to create Caleb Cumberland, even though God doesn't create Caleb Cumberland. Like in some other world where only dinosaurs exist, God would still have a reason to create Caleb Cumberland because it's good that Caleb Cumberland exists. So that would be a sense in which we could say that God's reasons for doing certain things are intrinsic and also necessary, but they're just not going to be necessarily entailing some sort of active creation regarding that sort of intention or reason that God has.
So let me start on places where common ground agreement, because I think you are getting at something that's very important here, and that someone like me who's pressing a modal collapse argument certainly wants on the table, and that's the idea of God's perfect rationality. This idea that God intends to act in certain ways rather than others because he acts for reasons. And so I think that this points us to one of those concepts that was in my brief that I said if we needed to come back to it, it might be helpful to. And so I think coming back to it now will be helpful, and it's what I'm calling God's divine providence. And so according to God's divine providence, God has absolute control over the contingency of the universe, in the sense that God's intentional act is the intrinsic source of the contingency of everything extrinsic to God. God's intentional act entirely determines whether our universe, some other universe, or nothing at all actually obtains. So what I think that this implies is what's often been called God's infallible omnipotence. So if God intends to create our world rather than something else or nothing at all, then our world could not fail to obtain. And so I think when we put God's divine providence like this, there's some really important consequences that I think it imply the modal collapse, the modal fatalism. And so again, I think that what we're talking about is God's intentional act. So prior to creation, God's intentional act, his intention to create something rather than nothing, is entirely intrinsic to him because he's the source and he has absolute control over the contingency of the world. This follows from God's divine providence. So God's intentional act, so we can say, God's intentional act, we'll demarcate that for now, to create our universe rather than something else or nothing at all. So there's the actual world, the world that he created. He could have created some other world or nothing at all. But God's intentional act to create our universe rigidly designates the same intentional act across all possible worlds. That's the part I think that implies the modal collapse. Once you've granted God's divine providence, that gets you to the point where, okay, we can't avoid the modal collapse at this point. If we say that God acts intentionally, so there's only two things that we can deny here, is that we can either deny that God intentionally creates our world rather than something else, or that God's omnipotence is not infallible, that God intended to create something, but something else came about. And to me, that's the dilemma. Neither of those options seem very good, because you're either going to end up with what Danny was alluding to, this, denying that God's intentions are, something intrinsic to him, that they're kind of something else, or that God has this really weird omnipotence that just like, he tries to do, create in certain ways, but just other things indeterministically just boom, come about in creation. I just think both of those have problems.
I want to reinforce what you're saying, if that's okay with
sure, please.
The idea
I'm probably rambling at this point.
No. I think it's good. What I gathered from Ben is that if God's number one infallible and perfectly rational, that he's always he will always do what he has most reason to do. And the idea is that when he acts, presumably he had most reason to act in that way. And given the infallibility, the idea of doing otherwise is just not, that possibility is not there. Otherwise, he'd be doing what he has less reason to do. And by definition, he's not that kind of being. So every act is sort of necessitated. So suppose we say that God had a reason, he had most reason to create the universe and us in it, over not rather than not. That would sort of necessitate the universe in existence, given that the possibility of doing otherwise is closed, because that's what God has less reason to do. Otherwise, you get the alternative option that Ben suggested, is that it's just random. It's not that God had most reason to create the universe and us in it. It's that it was a dice roll in terms of God's beingness and the universe existing like it is now here today. I think is that kind of what you were getting at, Ben? Something similar?
Yeah, I think more or less. So the only place where I might press back a little bit is, well, I don't know. I thought I had something and now I've kind of lost it.
But I liked the idea of why is there something rather than nothing. The idea is that God created the universe. He had most reason to do that, which means that, and there's no world in which he would have less reason. He would act on what he has less reason to do. So that implies that the universe is necessary, and that's kind of the start, the smell of modal collapse.
So it's certainly the smell of modal collapse. So the where I would maybe press back a little bit is this idea that God is kind of trapped in this. He can only do what is he has most reason to do. I think there might be a set of possible choices that God has sufficient reason to choose among. And then so that he could choose, and it wouldn't count against his rationality in any way if he were to choose among this set of possible choices. What I think the problem is when you say, look, God intended for this choice to happen. Okay, well, if he intended, that intention is something intrinsic to him. He has that intention in every possible world. It's not that in some other possible world he has a different intention, and in a different possible world he has a different intention. And he could have sufficient reasons for any of these choices. The problem comes down to what I'm calling divine providence. This idea, the two ideas: one, that God intentionally chooses between the possible worlds that he actualizes, and God's infallible omnipotence. Whatever he intends happens because he intended it, not because of something else, not indeterminate. It's his intentions. His intentions are serve as the explanatory role. In why is there something rather than God? Nothing, because God intended it.
Right. So there's a way in which I think we could have like a strong sort of sense of providence included with classical theism. We'll see. If like when we're talking, because there's a way in which I think our usage of the word intentions, or does intentionally and has intentions, things like that, is sort of like equivalently used when we talk about decisions. So like I decide to kill Danny, or I have made the decision to let Danny live, something like that. And I don't think that like I'd want to say that a decision is intrinsic to me. I mean, yes, it's definitely the case that the decision was produced by me. Like I was the one that decided X. But I don't like when we're talking about a decision, I don't think we're even like talking about any sort of like property or things that like something that a person has. Like, does that make sense to that? Like a decision is not a property of a person, and it maybe not even like intrinsic to a person. I don't know.
I would be hesitant to, because I think that an intention is a property
a decision.
Of a person.
So if I'm using decision,
but a decision, I think
right,
presupposes an intention. So like if you're saying like what is an intention, I think decisions imply substances with properties.
Okay.
I think where you're coming from, John, is that sometimes decisions imply behaviors, and behaviors could be extrinsic. So, like, you see, the way I understand an action is that you have an intention, and then maybe some behavior. If I act to lift, my lemonade, right, the behavior, the eliminated is outside of me. That's not of me. Even my hand is not of me in the mental sense, right? It's actually I'm kind of, it's almost like a tool of my rationality. And so that's, I think that the reason why it might sound really weird to say decisions are not intrinsic is because they imply behavioral states and dispositions outside of the mind. So when God creates the universe, right, the action of creating the universe implies an extrinsic state, namely the universe, but there is some intrinsic will, right, that sort of explains that outcome, that behavior or disposition.
Right.
I think there's. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna like affirm what you were saying there, Ben. That like maybe a decision still implies an intention behind it, and so it's not gonna like avoid the objection at all. So like it's still gonna be worthwhile to talk about intentions being intrinsic rather than some further thing, decisions maybe being extrinsic because they refer to a behavior rather than some internal state that God has or an agent has.
I would also, the other worry that I would want to kind of stick a pin in here is the order of causal explanation. So I think that it would be weird to say that whatever creation obtained is what explains what intention God had. I would want to say that no, the classical theist is committed to God's intention being what explains what creation obtains. And so like they're committed to that, the order of that causal explanation, because and so if we're saying that God's intentional act is something extrinsic to him, it seems that something extrinsic to God, and we're saying God intention, and we're also saying God intentionally acted. We're saying that the order of causal explanation seems to be flipped here. It seems to be that whatever creation obtains is what explains what intention God had, and that seems strange to me. It doesn't seem to me that that's a move that a classical theist can make without some theoretical cost, at least.
No, yeah, definitely. if the existence of the world somehow like explained God's creation of the world, then it seems like in some sense God's act of creation depends upon this thing that's supposed to be like causally posterior to God's act of creation. And so, yeah, then you have a sort of like weird sort of dilemma there. Okay, in regards to the sort of concern about like God's intention and its role in creation. There is a interesting, I guess, like parity argument that actually Joe Schmid makes in his paper, The Fruitful Death of Modal Collapse Arguments, where he basically makes the similar sort of power or argument for modal collapse while using like against a non-classical theistic model of God. Because like when the non-classical theist wants to say that God has an intention to create our particular world, there's going to be a question of, okay, where did this intention come from? Was it something that was produced by God's nature, God's character, or something like that? Well, God's nature or God's character is going to be necessary. That means it doesn't differ in different worlds. So, because, yeah, definitely, God's nature would be an essential property to God, so it would have to be necessary in the same way that God is. And so if it's the case that God's character brings about some intention, but this intention to create our world is contingent, then it seems like we still have this sort of like contingency coming from necessity here. And so there's a sort of concern as well. So I'll actually read out the argument. It's sort of short, but the infallibly omnipotent creator of this world exists necessarily entails that this world exists. It's obvious because, yeah, if you have a creator of this world, that implies that there is that world. If the infallibly omnipotent creator of this world exists of absolute necessity, then this world exists of absolute necessity. And that's an exact parity to the other argument that, like, if God exists of absolute necessity, and God's action and then God's actions would also exist of absolute necessity. That's the sort of
Right,
drawing
it's
the
the
parallel.
paradox of a contingent fact being explained by a necessary fact. On my view, that doesn't make much sense. It would just make it seems like what Joe is saying is that the contingent in what sense would the contingent fact be contingent? And so, if, for instance, Pluto is, let's say it's blue, I think it is. If we're explaining that in terms of God's nature, right, then it seems like necessarily Pluto is blue. It couldn't be otherwise, given that God's nature is never otherwise.
Right. Yeah. So this is like this whole sort of line of argumentation would equally apply, I think, to the non-classical theists, because you'll still have this contingent feature of reality, God's intention to create this particular world, brought about from some necessary feature to reality, that being God's character or God's nature or God's existence, something like that. And so there's still going to be this sort of concern that the non-classical theist has, that the classical theist will just say that, well, God's decisions come from God immediately rather than through some sort of middleman, that being God's intentions or God's beliefs or desires or God's character or something like that. So what are your thoughts on that, Ben?
So I think it's the first thing that I would want to say that's important for discussing Joe's paper on the fruitful death of modal collapse arguments is that he's giving this in the context of what he calls a simple modal collapse argument. And so I think this is like a three-premised argument with a conclusion. And so that's not what I'm giving tonight. I'm not giving a simple modal collapse argument. The argument that I'm giving will appeal to things like God's intentional act and something like divine providence. And Joe's most recent article also uses the term, hey, there's several lines in which he concedes things like causal indeterminism, but he goes, is this really incompatible? Is this really compatible with God's divine providence? And so that's the sort of argument that I'm putting on the table, and not the simple modal collapse argument, because I don't think that argument really engages or interacts with the metaphysics that classical theists and people who accept the doctrine of divine simplicity are really committed to. And so the second thing that I would want to say is that if we can extend this modal collapse objection to affect non-classical models of theism, from atheist perspectives, so much the worse for theism.
Right.
I get the dialectical, like I'm saying this tongue in cheek because I get the dialectical context where a non-classical theist, who might be trying to use this argument as a weapon to, against a classical theist model, might want to be careful in doing that, because I think you're right. I want to give some credit to this in the sense that there's a double-edged sword. The classical theist, the non-classical theist can only press this so far and, make certain claims before the modal collapse objection starts to apply to their model of God too. What I want to say is that the non-classical theist has a plausible out in the denial of the doctrine of divine simplicity. But if they press other claims too hard, you're exactly right. There's this double-edged sword. It's going to start cutting into the non-classical theist.
But I think the way that they get out, the reason why I don't think this applies to what John brought up was, what about a case where, we explain some contingent fact about the world in terms of God's nature. Well, seems like that's not going to be a contingent fact at all. But at least they have a resource that, well, it could be explained by a brutally contingent feature of God, right? And so, but what I think Ben's argument shows is that the people that hold to the doctrine of divine simplicity won't have access to that sort of feature, given that all of God's properties, in some sense, are the same, or God's identical to his properties, or they're necessary properties being identical. And so the idea here is that I think we're preserving the argument well, I think that what John brought up, the non-classical theist is going to be able to have a resource of brutally contingent facts that are of God, whereas the the person that holds the divine simplicity is not going to have that resource.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think as a classical theist, maybe a concern I would have there is like, well, if we have this feature of God that's brutally contingent, it doesn't seem like it's produced by God. It's something that's like an aspect of God that he didn't contribute towards at all. And because it's a brute contingency. And so then it seems like, okay, well, this brute contingency brought about our world out of intentions. And then it seems like, well, then no longer would it be the case that the non-classical theistic God created our world, but rather this contingent feature that he had. Hold on a second.
So I think there is some wisdom in the Kathleen Rogers repackaging move here, in just kind of biting the bullet and just embracing it is and repackaging is something like modal simplicity. I think there is some wisdom in that move. I think see, like, once you do that, once you take that move on, then the objection just doesn't have any bite to it. It's just, you're kind of in like a Spinozan camp. Spinozans don't, people are like, oh, well, Spinozanism is fault. They think that just the obvious intuition is that, oh, well, this modal fatalism is just an implausible implicate. They don't even argue for it. Even in paper, in written papers, they just take it for granted that it's false. I think Kathleen Rogers really brilliantly in the repackaging, it just says, look, what if I just bit the bullet? And I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't have a response to that. Like, I don't have an argument. I don't have a further objection.
You don't have an objection to necessitarianism?
If someone bites the bullet to it, like if just someone says, I bite that implausible implication, what argument do you give? If you just say, well, no, it just seems like there obviously things could have been otherwise. What do you say to the person that just says, no, things couldn't have been otherwise?
Seems like you can give a reductio ad absurdum.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Like
so that's what's being offered. Maybe. Like this modal fatal, like the modal collapse argument, is a reductio ad absurdum. What do you say to the person who says, and just bites the bullet on the absurdity of it? I don't have anything else.
Yeah. I mean, you could like resort to, oh, well, your view is counterintuitive. And I think that is like a cost of the theory, because like we should be trying to like work in alignment with our intuitions until we have reason to reject those intuitions. And
that's fair. But, what does that really, so like, relativity theory is like super counterintuitive, like, sure, we could all
relativity.
Yeah, but I'm saying, like, we could all easily concede that like some theory, has these, things that count against them, but they could be just outweighed by other discriminating factors that are just overwhelming, like observations or so I don't know. I see some wisdom in the Rogers move of just biting the bullet.
Yeah. And it's funny too, because like Michael Almeida, he holds to a sort of like modal realism. But he's still a theist. He thinks that like God creates or like brings about all possible states of affairs, and so that's just like way too bloated for my ontology things. But yeah, I mean, it's still like that's technically that's compatible with some sort of modal collapse, if you wanted to say.
There's an argument in the pro-life camp, and it's called the argument from moral risk. And so it's this idea that like, hey, if there's, a non-negligible chance that, you're going to kill someone with a right to life, you shouldn't, kill this person with a right to life. And one of the objections this is in the literature, and I find it so strange. And the objection is that, well, do they apply this consistently? Because a similar argument can be used for veganism, people don't apply this principle to, when they're considering eating some meat. But I go, but what do you say to the person that's vegan? Like, that objection just has no force for them. Like, you could just say, oh, well, that's just here's a reductio ad absurdum of your position, because it just implies that you'd have to do all these other things that you just clearly don't do. that doesn't.
Yeah, but they do this. Like, yeah.
Yeah, like a vegan could just take that argument and be like, "Yep, you're right. You shouldn't. This is just another argument to not eat meat."
Yeah.
Because you might be killing things that have a right to life. And so there's a non-negligible chance that animals that we kill and farm and eat have a right to life. And so, and I just thought that was such a and so, you know, in preparing for this debate with Trent Horn, this is when I was like, all I know is that I hope someone comes to me with that objection so I can just dunk on it.
There you go.
I don't think I doubt Trent. We've already exchanged our openings, and he's not doing anything like that. But I just thought, wow, that's such a terrible response to this argument.
I will have to leave soon, but we can still probably go through questions. But I also wanted to bring up, like, even if it's like the modal collapse objection also applies to non-classical theists, there's a way in which it could also apply to certain forms of atheism, I think, as well, especially if like you're inclined towards this sort of Graham-Oppian theory that like there is some sort of necessary feature to reality, and this necessary feature to reality indeterministically brings about other states of affairs. So you still have necessity and contingency, but it would just be the case that this I don't know, timeless, spaceless, natural entity that's necessary brought about the very first, like, if we want to say the singularity is basically the natural explanation for contingency. Then we're still going to have this necessary feature to reality that causally produces non-necessary features to reality. And so any sort of like objection against classical theism that says, oh, well, that sort of move from some necessary thing causally producing a non-necessary thing is just not going to work, because necessity must only ever follow from necessity. And it's not the case that you can have contingency following from necessity. Then that would also imply a sort of modal collapse to a Graham-Oppian sort of view, which is actually why he rejects determinism. Or I don't know, possibly a reason. I think he's also said that like he doesn't think that the science of physics like is best accounted for under determinism. But so anyway, that was just my point, that like a similar sort of objection, modal collapse objection, could be leveled against the atheist as well, if they hold to a sort of Oppian position.
Yeah, which is why I'm sort of skeptical of any thesis that wants to explain contingency in terms of necessity, whether theistic or not.
So this is where I get to talk about Hegel. So this is where I'm going to be the most excited. So I think you're right in saying that like there is this kind of worry of modal collapse. If we're going to say that the something is necessary within our ontology, and that, you know, everything comes from that necessary ontology, then, you know, how does, you know, it not follow that there's this modal collapse problem? And so the way that I like to approach that problem is to kind of give the Hegelian synthesis, to try to just say that the answer that's kind of the blend between the two is that necessarily there's at least one member of the set of contingent things. So there's a universe that's contingent. It's a set of contingent things. And the modal truth of why there's something rather than nothing is just necessarily, so in every possible world where there's something rather than nothing, there's at least one member of the set of contingent things. So the reason the universe as a whole exists is because it is composed of, or is identical with, the successively dependent states of the universe. Each state of the universe is sufficiently explained by earlier parts of the universe, and the existence of the universe as a whole is entailed by the existence of all contingent parts of that compose this.
Is that like the Humean response to like the Leibnizian like contingency?
Kind of. It's just certainly built on that. I like to think of it as more Hegelian than Humean, but that might just be me being ridiculous.
What does he say that that?
So Hume's point about the cosmological argument is that we can't move from reasoning about parts to wholes without committing a fallacy of composition. And so this idea that we can apply something like to the principle of sufficient reason to the universe as a whole, we're not actually justified in that movement. But he's not denying that the universe can just pop it, because he thinks, like, look, there is this, but we actually don't have the justification for extending it to something like the beginning of the universe, because our experience doesn't go back that far. And remember, he's a radical empiricist. And so he's just like, look, these assumptions that we make about the, universe, the beginning of the universe, I don't deny them necessarily. However, we just don't have any, like when you try to argue for them, when you try to use induction for them, that you end up in a circle. When you try to move from parts to wholes, you commit the fallacy of composition. And so he shows all these skeptical ways of like, look, the ways in which the cosmological argument moves are fallacious. There might be other not fallacious moves, but he can't find them. And he finds similar problems, in induction and other things. The soul, the idea, or when I shouldn't say the soul, personal identity. So Hume, the idea that there's this irreducible fact that makes an entity the same entity through time. It was another thing. He was just like, look, we're just not justified in that belief. He's not denying that there is this further irreducible fact of identity. It's just like, it's just not part of our experience. And we can't actually justify it in any move that's not fallacious.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking of something else in terms of there's the set of contingent events that operate in some kind of causal succession, and then there's a different set in some other world. And I thought that Hume wanted to explain when it comes to the question of what explains why one set is actual rather than another. That
I think you're referring to something in the dialogues. I'm sorry.
That's fine. That's fine.
Yeah.
The idea is
one
that
of his characters. It's Philo replying to Cleanthes at one point, and he's undermining the cosmological. He's saying, look, there could be these other, it might not just be one cause. There could be, an endless source of different causes causing other things, and we're a product of that. I'd have to go look it up. I'd have to go look it again.
We're digressing, but yeah.
Yeah, we are digressing. I'm sorry. I get easily distracted in philosophical
interesting stuff. So.
And this obviously, all of this touches on a lot of things. So I do want to get to the Q&A because I know John has to go, and I don't want the discussion to go on too long, but I know that we could keep going. So I'm going to go to that, and then I'll let us close with any closing thoughts. So Deconverted Man asks Ben, can God be different than what God is, or is God constrained to be what God is?
Good luck, theist.
So I'm going to give, as an atheist from the outside, it's going to depend on the model of God that you adopt. So that's the sort of question that you would want your model of God, your concept of God, to be able to answer satisfactorily. And so I think certain models of God answer that question better than others. And I think that something like perfect being theism is committed to this idea that God doesn't have some sort of fixed nature, but God has a perfectly free nature, that God is not constrained except by things like, mathematics or morality or, things of, necessary nature. And he's not radically limited. Like if God could have intentionally chosen X, he could have also intentionally chosen Y or even Z. And so I think that you really want that model of God, like the most plausible models of theism, I think, have that perfect freedom built into them.
One of the three black dots in the background of Ben. So I think it's to your right, Ben. There's like some.
It's a cat tree with little balls on little sticks for the cats to play with.
All right, and then for John, when someone says God is love, they are not saying God loves X. So how would you respond?
Just concede it. Again, this is a reductio ad absurdum. Just bite the bullet, bro.
They might use like God is love as a sort of basis for their saying that God loves X. So like the reason they might say that God loves Caleb Cumberland or Ben Watkins is because God is love and God sustains Ben Watkins and Caleb Cumberland in existence. And so that might be like a sort of argument that they might use to say that it's true that God loves X, given that God is love. Usually what they might use to sort of defend the position that God is love, in that like God is ontologically identical to the existence of love, or I guess so. Or maybe that God's love is wholly of himself. So God is identical to God's having of love, or God's loving. They might use let's see, what would be the basis for, I guess one reason to think that God is love is that if God is sort of a primary reality, so God exists wholly of himself, he doesn't require anything other than himself in order to exist. Any reason that he might have to create something is not going to be based upon some certain needs that God has of himself, but rather he would be acting like, if for God to create the world, God would be acting on the basis of altruistic reasons. So the reason that God creates Danny is not because God needs Danny in order for God to be happy. God is like wholly intrinsically existent of himself and has his happiness wholly of himself. But God might still have reasons to create Danny because he recognizes it would be good if Danny existed. And so that would be a reason that God has to create Danny, but not a reason for God to create Danny, but rather a reason for Danny to be created. And so that would be God is willing the good of another, and acts on the basis of that which he wills of the good for the other. And so that would be a reason to think that, like, well, to love someone is to will the good of the other. And so whenever God creates something extrinsic to himself, God is lovingly creating them. That would be a reason, but then I'm sure there's going to be certain objections.
Well, this kind of follows up. So Travis asks, doesn't God select a thin red line or whatever it may be and then actualize it? And I think that that's going to get into the nature of intentionality. And I know this has been discussed by somebody asked if we've discussed Pat Flynn's comments, and I don't know all of Pat Flynn's comments, but I think on his channel they've discussed this some. And yeah, I think, there is debate about the nature of intentionality and how that would apply to any agent, and God in particular. So on one model, it's God's action and the selection are one and the same. And again, whether you want to say that's intrinsic or extrinsic, but it's going to depend. But I don't know if you guys have anything else, or if you want to comment on that question.
What do you think he means by he selects a thin red line and then actualizes it?
You asked the question I was going to ask, so
Okay.
I don't know what he means by.
I think
Doesn't
Travis
God
is saying,
select a
isn't it
thin red
something
line?
that's in the mind prior, and then it becomes an actualized outside of God? So he's saying, like, isn't
Yes,
that
I think
that
it's
has to
causally
start?
prior. That was my point earlier about it being causally prior. So like God's intention to do something is causally prior to that thing happening. It's, the effect doesn't explain what the cause was. The cause explains why the effect happens.
So, like, under the understanding that it's like God would have a reason to create Danny in all possible worlds, insofar as for Danny to exist, it would be a good thing.
That's the most sense you've made all night. So,
but it wouldn't be the case that God creates Danny in all worlds. So, is there something further than God having a reason to do X that you're like requiring as some sort of intention that God has for God to do X? Because, like, I don't know, it at least makes some sense to me that, like, for God to act intentionally is just for God to act and God to have a reason for his action. But if there's something more that you're like wanting to get out of sort of cashing out the phrase that God acts intentionally, that would be helpful. Ben, I guess.
So again, so I would want to focus on, so what I'm referring to is God's intentional act.
Mhm.
So in classical theism, we've got God's existence and we've got his essence. And so I am understanding God's intentional act as part of his essence. So it's something intrinsic to him.
Mhm.
So when you say, is there anything extra to this picture? No, there's God's existence. Then what I'm using as a placeholder for God's essence here is God's intentional act.
Mhm.
And then there's creation. There's the created thing, so God's intentional act constitutes part, creator.
Mhm.
Then there's creation, something separate
Mhm.
from, ontologically distinct from God, something that is not God,
Right.
is created from that. And so I take those to be two different things, and that those two things have to be different.
Right. But you would say that God's intentional action intentional act is not God, right? It's something
So
other than God.
So God's intentional act is intrinsic to God. It's part of his essence. Creation, the object of the intentional act, is something separate. So there's God's existence. He exists. But then we also want to say God's existence is also identical to his essence. Well, what does his essence consist in? I think one of the things that consists of God's essence is God's intentional act to create this universe rather than some other universe or nothing at all.
Right.
That
Okay.
entire intentional act has to be intrinsic to God.
And you would just take it as like a part of God, that God's intentional act.
We don't want to say a part of God. It's his. So again,
like
yeah,
a and then part. Yeah.
yeah.
Something.
So
Yeah.
it's part of God's essence.
Mhm.
It's an intrinsic feature of God, such that it's identical to all of God's other.
Right.
Because again, this is a power-based
Mhm.
modal collapse argument. So there has to be a connection between God's existence and his essence for this to even be
Right.
the personalists out is to just deny that God's essence is identical to his existence. So I have to be making some connection.
Mhm.
And so I want to say that the connection is that God's intentional act is part of his essence, and that his essence, according to the doctrine of divine simplicity, is identical to God's existence. That's the feature that then raises the modal collapse worry, and God's divine providence, I think, cements it. I think a lot of the moves that are used to kind of get out of that the simple modal collapse problem, once you are clear about God's divine providence, those moves aren't available anymore, except for the non-classical theist.
All right.
The
Last
non-classical
question.
theist has that out.
Yeah. Okay. So last question. Do you think that God produces this part of himself, or if this is something that's not something that God produces? Because I guess there's still going to be a worry.
It's a free will. So if you're asking me what determines it, I can't give an answer for that, because the theists, by their own conception, that God is perfectly free.
Right.
So God's the source of his act, in the sense that the act doesn't depend on anything other than himself. But it's also free in the sense that it could have been otherwise. It was undetermined. I have to use that concept,
Okay.
or I'd just be straw manning.
Right. So you would say then this part of God, his action, this thing that's intrinsic to him, is caused or produced by God.
He's the source of it. Yeah. So whatever terms that however you want to cash that out. Okay, but what I would want to insist on is that God is the source of it. There's nothing, and this is an ontological point. There's nothing extrinsic to God prior to creation.
Right. Yeah, I guess there's just a worry then that you have a bit of self-causation, I guess, where God is causing this part of
that's
himself.
what libertarian free will is this idea that we are first causes of our actions, that we are causa sui, so to speak.
Well,
we can cause ourselves.
yeah, I would say, yeah, we
Yeah.
cause our actions, but I wouldn't say that our actions are part of us. Rather, they're just some sort of change in the world that we're bringing about. I guess for the person that does think our actions are part of us, they are sort of committing themselves to a sort of causa sui there. And I wonder if that would like even apply to compatibilists as well, because like compatibilists, they'll still want to say that we are the source of our actions.
Yes.
So if there's some part of ourselves that causes us to produce certain behaviors,
We'd say that we as sources were also determined as sources, but that's compatible with the other sense of could have done otherwise. There's this hypothetical sense in which a source of an act could have done otherwise.
all right. So they'll still say that we're the cause of our own actions or the source of our actions.
Well, yeah,
It's just
because
that
if
our
someone was
cause-
holding a gun to my head, the compatibilist is going to say, "Look, I couldn't have done otherwise. I wasn't the source of my action on that. The person holding the gun to my head was the source of the act."
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes more sense then. Okay, I see then how the compatibilists will get around that.
All right, then Travis asks, is the doctrine of divine simplicity necessary for classical theism? Can a classical theist deny the doctrine? And I guess I would just respond, it depends upon how you define classical theism, but the tradition certainly affirms some doctrine of divine simplicity, though, as was mentioned earlier, there are different conceptions like, Thomistic or Scotus or, the Ptolemist type distinction and so on. But anything else you guys want to add on this question?
I would just want to say that, like, if you're going to weaken the doctrine of, like Caleb said, I think the classical theist tradition is at least committed to some form of the doctrine of divine simplicity. However, if you're going to weaken it, I think that's going to come at a theoretical cost. You're making it less so the reason that we're using this very simple, straightforward model of doctrine of divine simplicity is because it's so simple, because of the theoretical virtues that it afford, and that's what you want. Like with what's my understanding of the classical theist model is that you want this supremely simple model. And so it's kind of like a utilitarian that's, like utilitarian wants to give you this supremely simple moral principle, but then they've got to carve out all these exceptions to it. Well, all that carving out of the exceptions to it, I think, counts against the theory. And so I think that also happens to be the case here. If you're going to take the doctrine of divine simplicity and you're just going to weaken it, there's a theoretical cost that comes with that, of modesty.
All right, and this will be the final question. So Travis asked, would the Hegelian deny even the explanatory principle? And I don't know exactly what he's getting at there, but
I don't know which explanatory principle. So the Hegelian is going to want to hang on to this idea of deep explanation, of this idea of a PSR that kind of goes all the way down.
Yeah, I
so
think
to speak.
He was speaking about that in regards to like every contingent fact has some sort of explanation for its occurring. I think that's what he was meaning.
So like the idea that there's this explanatory fact for this big conjunctive fact that
or just any contingent fact will have some explanation for it itself. So that would be the explanatory principle that I think he's referring to.
Yeah. So okay. Because the worry is that if you're explaining everything down, but at the bottom everything is necessary, then you get this modal collapse. And so the Hegelian is trying to find that middle ground of saying, like, no, look, we can't explain things all the way down, but we don't get modal collapse. And that's because the necessary truth, necessary there exists one member of the set of contingent things, is a claim of identity. It's a claim about the set of contingent things. And so it's not that it follows from this fact that everything is necessary. It's that no, and so this also is the middle ground. There's the atheist. Look, the universe is contingent, and that's just it. There's no further explanation. There's nothing else to be said. Well, there's a middle ground. You can say, no, there's a modal truth. Yeah, the universe is contingent, but out of all the possible ways that the universe could be, it's necessary that there's at least one contingent thing. And so that's a modal truth about all possible worlds. And so that's the way in which the Hegelian tries to find this middle ground of trying to say that the world is rational all the way down, but avoid this modal fatalism and preserve contingency in the world.
All right, this will be the last question, and then we're gonna, part with our closing thoughts. But this one just came in. What do you think the best argument is for the real distinction between essence and existence? And I don't really have an idea, or I guess I'm not big on the essence existence distinction personally, but I guess you could take the question in two different ways, whether it's about whether God has a distinction between his essence and existence, or for the doctrine of essence and existence altogether. And I don't know which way they're intending it, but I'll let you guys comment. I don't have a strong preference here.
Yeah, I sort of agree. I'm sort of skeptical of the distinction. I'm not an essentialist. I think that I only accept one mode of necessity, and that's logical necessity. So I don't any other sorts of necessities might be what makes up essence. But I'm just sort of skeptical of all that. So.
Yeah, so I'm monist about existence. So I think that things in the causal domain all exist in the same way. And so if we're going to then say that there's this other, I would follow Kant and say that existence isn't a real predicate. And if we're going to want to talk about something's essence, I would just default to modal language and say that, some substances have their properties essentially, and some have their properties contingently. That's kind of where I am in the metaphysics of, that language game. I don't know what an argument for the real distinction between essence and existence would really look like. That's my best stab at it.
Sure. Yeah. And I don't know if you're interested in sort of like Thomas Aquinas's sort of like defense of there being a distinction in creaturely things and there being no distinction for God between his essence and his existence. He wrote a paper, I guess, back then. That's actually pretty short. Maybe it's technically like a article or whatever on being in essence.
I think I get the question now.
Yeah, it's 17 pages long. So if you're wanting to at least know more about Thomas Aquinas's position on essence and existence, that's where
I think he's asking what is the best argument for a non-classical model of God to deny the doctrine of divine simplicity that says that essence and God's essence and existence are identical. He wants to the distinction in creatures. Nope, I'm sorry. I tried.
The classical argument has kind of been like, well, you can know the essence of something without knowing that it exists. Like you could know all about a unicorn, but it won't tell you a unicorn exists. So there's a distinction. I don't quite buy that argument. I think a better argument might be something like, that different things have different causal powers or something like that. And maybe that indicates that there's an essence. And then you could, whether the essence is then instantiated or not, would be more of the route I might go. But there are different ways to try to get there.
That sounds like Kant too, in the sense, essence doesn't imply existence.
But
there are no non-existent essences.
Right. That's the end of the questions before the cutoff. And then, anything else you guys, I know John has to go, but anything else you guys want to share about the discussion or anything else coming up? Or
I think we
made some good progress there. So.
Be sure to tune in to me and Trent in our Devil's Advocate debate this Friday. If you have any questions, I'm still working through my modal collapse arguments. I'm still working on the briefs and stuff. If anyone has any questions or anything, hit me up. I'd love to keep talking about them and keep working on this, and hopefully keep making progress on this project. Thanks for having me on.
I'll just say, yeah, I mean, this is still something I'm like actively researching on. And so like, yeah, I'm still engaged in the discussion here, but at least right now, yeah, I'm kind of like testing out the waters in regards to consideration of like, okay, a sort of praxeological predication, I guess. So when we're talking about what a thing does is going to be different from a sort of ontological predication, what a thing is. And so, yeah, I think that's a very useful distinction to have, not only in regards to creaturely actions, but I think even in regards to divine actions, where like what God does is going to be different depending upon different worlds that God creates. And so, yeah, I think like, I don't know, some classical theists like Thomas will still, I don't know, I think buy too much into this and like conflate these two things as well. We're saying that like, no, what God does is identical to what God is. And so, and I think if you hold to that sort of strong position, you probably are going to like entail some sort of like modal collapse there, unless you sort of clarify that somewhat in that saying like, well, there's a difference between what God does and how God does. And like I was saying earlier, but yeah, in regards to like God's intentional actions, I don't know. I'm also kind of testing out the waters, I guess, in regards to saying that like propositional attitudes are something a thing does rather than a way that a thing is. Because like it seems like when we're talking about a way that a thing is, we're going to use sort of is predications of like John is X. And I don't know if you can quite like make that sort of predication in regards to intentional actions or intentions that a thing has. Like John is intending X to occur, maybe. But that just seems like it could be put as John intends for X to occur. And that does seem like it's a propositional attitude that I have in regards to something else. And it's going to presuppose that I exist prior to me even having the ability to have this propositional attitude. And so maybe because my existence, my action presupposes my existence, my intentional actions are going to be extrinsic to my existence. Anyway, we already sort of went over that, but yeah, this is still something I'm sort of working through. But yeah, if there's any Thomists that are mad at me, you're welcome to correct my defense of classical theism on Twitter. I'm at writer John Buck, but that's it.
Thanks for having me on.
All right. Well, thanks for watching and thanks for joining me, and we'll be signing off.